Hi guys, welcome back. I know it's been a while since we last had an Ed Puzzle video, but we're going to talk about American life after the War of 1812, what's called the Era of Good Feelings. And this is going to take us all the way up to to 1824, and then we'll start our next chapter, which is the Age of Jackson. But following the War of 1812, there's really a stranglehold on the country from a political perspective by the Republican Party. James Monroe, who was a war hero, served as Secretary of State for President Madison, wins overwhelmingly against a Federalist Rufus King. Really, the Federalists are dead after the events of the Hartford Convention. And Monroe actually wins every single electoral vote except for one. There's a famous incident of one of the electors who refused to cast a vote for Monroe because the story goes that he wanted Washington to be the only unanimously elected president. We remember in our podcast it's not entirely true, but that's the story. And really, his presidency, the next 8 years, are called the Era of Good Feelings. And that's because we have American morale and nationalism is really the highest it's ever been, maybe even since the end of the American Revolution. We're going to see that the population is doubling tremendously thanks to high birth rates, as well as the rise in immigrants. We're going to see the pace of Western expansion tremendously will expand. That will also usher in immigrants. And we really start to see America exert itself on the international stage. So this is really an important time in American history. It's also dominated by one-party rule, which isn't necessarily a good thing, but really isn't much of a problem during this period. We'll see in the 1850s, one-party rule is not good for the United States. But what we also see is the federal government starting to assert itself as well. And it really begins with the Supreme Court. And there are a couple of very famous court cases that really do this. And it all began under John Marshall's reign as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. If you remember, his most famous case was Marbury versus Madison. But there are a few others that are really important. And I'm going to run through them quickly. You're going to be doing a chart on these that will get into more detail. But I'll just give you the basics about each one. So 1819, you have two very famous cases, Dartmouth College versus Woodward and McCulloch versus Maryland. In Dartmouth College, it determined that states are not allowed to interfere in private contracts, right? So the Supreme Court actually steps in and creates the free market system and says that contracts between individuals cannot be interfered with by the state. Again, you'll go into a lot more details with the chart. McCulloch versus Maryland deals with the national bank. And it really upholds the idea that the bank is okay and that it's allowed under the necessary and proper clause. So this is really asserting a congressional power on the Supreme Court saying that it is okay for Congress basically to pass whatever law it wants. Fletcher versus Peck, 1810, had previously occurred. That was kind of the precursor to Dartmouth College versus Woodward. And it said that binding contracts can't be invalidated. So if there are contracts between two individuals, even if they're illegal in the case of Fletcher versus Peck, which again, you'll go into more detail and look at, they can't be intervened by the federal government. And the last one was Gibbons versus Ogden. This again is an assertion of federal power. The idea that only Congress is allowed to regulate interstate commerce. There was a dispute between New York and New Jersey over waterways, who controls what. Interstate waterways, much like interstate highways, are controlled by the federal government. So this is an important assertion of federal power. So the Era of Good Feelings, all about stronger government, stronger nationalism, stronger sense of America, coming out of the War of 1812. And we're going to see that asserted on the international stage with some large expansions of the United States. The first one is Florida. We're going to buy Florida in 1819 as part of what's called the Adams-Onis Treaty. We're going to buy Florida for $5 million. And also Spain gave up claims to the Oregon Territory, which is going to be really important. We'll see eventually the U.S. also gives up claims to Texas, which we'll see will change dramatically as we get to the end of this year. But for now, we're good with Florida. So that what you can see on this map now is we have the entire eastern seaboard to ourselves, which is really important for the expansion of America. The next one, we're really going to ease tensions with Great Britain, and we're going to create a border officially at the 49th parallel which had been obviously disputed during the War of 1812. We're going to demilitarize that border, allow for free passage between each, and we're going to share the Oregon Territory, which is over here. You can see this, and then eventually, obviously, we will add that as we get further along in Western expansion. But really, the pivotal part of President Monroe's foreign policy that asserts America on the international stage, at least nominally, is the Monroe Doctrine. In Latin America, Spain is really devolving, right? It's lost Florida. It's lost most of its colonies. Many of its Latin American colonies are declaring their independence. And the concern of President Monroe and his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, is that foreign powers will start to intervene in those areas, and that poses a threat to the United States, right? Some kind of southern invasion. So Monroe issues a speech to Congress that was entirely written by John Quincy Adams, and basically declares what's called the Monroe Doctrine. And henceforth, all presidents have their foreign policy doctrines. And basically, it promised a number of things. It said the U.S. is not going to get involved in European affairs. We're not interested in what's going on over there. We're going to stay on our side of the Atlantic. We're not going to get involved. Any of these new independent countries in the Western Hemisphere, we're going to recognize their sovereignty, meaning we're going to recognize them as individual countries, and we're not going to get involved in them. However, if European powers cross the Atlantic and try and intervene in those newly created countries, then this will be considered an act of war against the United States. Now, this is purely really a nominal threat. The United States does not have the ability to back this up at all. But we're basically praying that the powers of Europe will recognize it and abide by it. And luckily they do, but that's more so for what's going on in Europe. But this was basically Monroe's assertion that the United States is now a dominant power in the Western Hemisphere and needs to be respected by Europe. And certainly you can see in this political cartoon here, right, the Monroe Doctrine is acting as a wall to the powers of Europe into the Western Hemisphere. And you can see the American Yankee down here, right, with the powers of Germany, powers of Great Britain that aren't allowed to cross over. So this is really an important assertion for the United States as a global power now coming out of the War of 1812, because we deserve that respect. We've defeated Great Britain for a second time, and this should really be a warning to those other powers. The other big thing that happens in President Monroe's administration, for better or for worse, is the Missouri Compromise. In 1820, Monroe basically ran unopposed. But the big thing that happens that's really going to shock the country is Missouri applies for statehood. And if you remember, during the Constitution, we won't really address slavery, right? We'll let someone else figure it out. That was the intention of the Founding Fathers, because they assumed that the next generation would solve it. And instead, this completely undoes that. At the time, there were 22 states, 11 slave states, 11 free states. And Missouri wants to enter applies for statehood as a slave state. And this would have upset the balance in the Senate, which everyone had attempted to keep even. And Southerners were worried that if they were outnumbered, then slavery could be eliminated. So what we have to do is come up with some kind of compromise that will please Southerners, that will allow Missouri to enter, but will also keep the status quo in terms of balance in the Senate. So Henry Clay, who was the leader of the Warhawks of the West and is known as the Great Compromiser, comes up with one of many compromises that he will create in Congress, and it's called the Missouri Compromise. And what we're going to do is we're going to let Missouri become a state. You can see here it will enter as a slave state in the red. To counter that, we need to create a free state. So what we're going to do is create Maine. If you remember way back during our colonization chapter, Massachusetts controlled Maine. So Maine will be created as a free state with a new border set with Great Britain as a free state. So now we've kept the balance in the Senate of free and slave. And then what we're going to do is basically legislate slavery in terms of where it cannot happen. We're going to draw this line right here. You can see this black line above the Arkansas Territory called at 3630. And it's going to basically say anything north of that, any new territories north of this line cannot have slavery. Anything south of it can if it so chooses, but nothing above it can. So what have we really done here? Well, we've done the opposite of what the Founding Fathers wanted, right? They wanted us to solve the issue of slavery, that next generation of great thinkers, and instead we've split the country in half. And you can see that any previous states can still have slavery, but nothing above this line can. And we've divided the country sectionally, it's called. We have the North and we have the South. We have the free states and the slave states. And really, we've pushed off the issue of slavery for the next generation to deal with. We have in no way answered the legality or constitutionality of slavery, and instead have said, we'll just let somebody else figure it out, which is only going to prolong the problem and eventually will obviously explode with the American Civil